Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Katz. I'm the chair of the Council of Christians and Jews in Victoria. Welcome to our function on a religious discussion on vaccinations, and we'll get to a bit more of that in a minute. Let me start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're all gathered. I'm on the Boonwurrung country of the Kulin Nation, and wherever we are, I hope we acknowledge and remember that we're sitting on Aboriginal land in Australia. So thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for being part of this discussion. As I said, this is the religious discussion on vaccinations with an Orthodox Jewish perspective and an Anglican Christian perspective. We'll start off, let me premise this by saying that as much as it's called a religious discussion on vaccinations, I believe that our two guest speakers are both vaccinated for COVID, as am I. And so I think this will be a discussion on positive response to vaccinations, although we will get into a few hesitancies and negatives and things like that as well. But in the meantime, we'll start off with our first speaker, who will be Rabbi AlexanderTsykin. He'll present his presentation, which will be followed by Reverend Melissa Clark giving a response. Let me introduce Rabbi AlexanderTsykin. He studied in Melbourne, Israel, and New York, has a BA in modern Jewish history, as well as rabbinic Orthodox ordination. After a few years in the UK as a chaplain at the University of Bristol, he returned to Melbourne in 2019 to take up his current role, which is at the Brighton Synagogue here in Melbourne, and he's a member of the Rabbinical Council of Victoria.
This is a Jewish perspective on vaccines. I'm going to start with what I think is honestly an extremely representative opinion, where basically, honestly, the vast majority of rabbis and Jewish authorities, I think, are in really firm agreement about vaccines. I'll flag sort of minor areas of disagreement that come up, but it's really actually not that much. Like I said, it's a Jewish perspective. It's intended to be representative. It's intended to be what most rabbis, I think, would agree with. We're also going to do a little bit of history about how vaccines developed and what people responded to there, because I think it's actually really interesting. It's really informative. I will try to talk at the end about specifically the COVID vaccine and why I think the COVID vaccine is really important, why I think it's frankly better than every other vaccine. Like as in everything I say today about vaccines in general is more true, not less true about the COVID vaccine. So yeah, let's start. There we go. Okay, so the value of life, and I think that this is really where we start. There we go. This is where we start in the discussion. It's really about the value that the Jewish religion ascribes to human life. So I've included, like the quotes that I'm doing are sort of a little bit random. There could have been a lot of more quotes on each of these topics, but obviously I am conscious of time. I was asked to speak for 20 minutes, I believe. So yeah. So let's go. It says, so we've got a quote from the Mishnah of Sanhedrin. The context of the Mishnah is, this is what the Jewish court would say prior to initiating a capital case. And the idea was that way everybody would take the gravity of what was about to happen to heart, and they would take it very seriously, and everybody would make sure they were very switched on and being very honest, right? So it says, therefore, Adam was created alone to teach you that anyone who destroys one soul, the verse describes him as if he destroyed an entire world. And anyone who sustains one soul, the verse describes him as if he sustained an entire world. So the idea is that Adam, being the first human being, was created as an individual before he was given a partner. And the reason why was to tell us that even one person contains worlds of people, right? The importance of one person is absolute. Literally, there is nothing more important than the life of one single person. There is never the option to sacrifice the life of a single person. And that's really, I think, the governing ethic in Judaism when we're talking about any sort of medical matter, right? And we see that this is a real halachic rule. So I've included, it's a pretty random example. A woman should not express into a cup on Shabbat or into a bowl. That's one of the rules on Shabbos, on the Sabbath. A woman ought not to express, right? And feed her child, right? So she shouldn't express and then give the child the milk in a bottle. And we do not nurse from a non-kosher animal, right? And a Jewish child should not nurse from a non-kosher animal because that would be drinking non-kosher milk. And if there was a danger, meaning if the child's life were for some reason in danger and these were the only ways to handle that situation, no words of commandment, meaning no commandment in the entire Torah, stands in place of saving a life. Right? So the entire Torah, with the exception of only 3 commandments, is put aside in its entirety when there is a danger to human life. Human life will take precedence. Now, obviously, that's a general statement. It really can't be taken to every single situation because you can almost always imply some sort of remote danger to human life, which would then preclude you from doing something. And we don't live that way, right? You can say you should never cross the road because who knows, maybe some crazy person will run you over and that's dangerous, right? None of us live our lives constantly fearful that every small action will result in the loss of our lives. So clearly there's going to be a threshold of danger which will trigger this idea that saving life becomes just the single overriding value and nothing stands in its place. But having said that, such an idea does exist, right? In a case of danger, saving life will become paramount. It will trump almost every other value. Okay, so moving on, right? There is an important idea, which I think it flows naturally, is the idea of not endangering others. And of course, this is relevant in the case of vaccines because we know that vaccines aren't just about me keeping myself safe, right? They're about me keeping everybody I come into contact with safe. So the point of not endangering others is actually really critical. And again, we find that there is very clear Torah law on the topic. You shall not go up and down as a slanderer among your people. That's not the relevant bit of the verse. But then it says, you shall not endanger the life of your neighbors. I am Hashem, right? That is the important bit of the verse. You shall not endanger the life of your neighbor. And we see once again, right? This is a real halachic idea which has real halachic ramifications, real Jewish legal ramifications. It is taught that Rabbi Natan says, from where is it derived that one may not raise a vicious dog in his house and that one may not set up an unstable ladder in his house, as it is stated, you shall not bring blood into your house, right? So we have, again, a general idea, a halachic rule, which says you have to keep those around you safe. Once again, there's going to be issues of what's the threshold, what triggers the obligation, right? What level of danger is acceptable, what level of danger is not. Again, right? I assume most people on the call drive cars. Obviously, when we get in behind the wheel of a car, we are assuming a certain amount of risk, not just for ourselves, but for everybody else who might be on the road. Right? Everybody else who's in the car, everybody else who might be on the road. And we sort of all viewed that as an acceptable level of risk for us to assume, not just on behalf of ourselves, on behalf of others. So there is a trigger, right? There'll be a point at which the risk is considered sufficient that it creates halachic obligations. But having said that, that point does exist. We'll discuss this a little bit more later because I think it is very relevant to the question of COVID vaccines. And I'll discuss at the end why I think COVID vaccines in particular seem to trigger this question of not endangering others. And then there's a third relevant halachic obligation, which again, it's going to come from the same space, but it is distinct, the idea of just generally staying healthy. So you're not allowed to endanger yourself or others. You're not allowed to, God forbid, sacrifice somebody's life, but you have a general obligation to keep your body in good working order, which is, of course, relevant to vaccines, right? Because that's the point. It says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. Now I've set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore choose life. And that's really the important words, right? In the simple meaning of this verse, it doesn't really mean that you keep yourself healthy, that you choose life on planet Earth sense. It means that you choose life in a sense of you choose the life-giving commandments that God has given us. But having said that, the way it has been taken for well over 2,000 years is that this imposes a reasonable an obligation to take reasonable steps to keep yourself healthy. And sometimes rabbis are actually really specific about what the steps we need to take to keep ourselves healthy is. For example, there have been rabbis who said, you must sleep 8 hours a day. And those rabbis didn't live in the 20th century, they lived in the 11th, right? So they were particularly enlightened. There are rabbis who talk about the need to eat sufficient quantities of food, but nevertheless moderate quantities, not to overeat, again, because they knew that that was generally healthy behavior. And it is a generally agreed principle that because of the obligation to keep ourselves healthy, we absolutely must consult a doctor if we are unwell, right? So if you find, this is a real halachic rule, if you find that you are unwell, it is incumbent on you under Jewish law to go and consult a doctor to get better. And when we say go and consult a doctor, we mean a doctor using medicine which is proven, right? So we mean medicine which is widely acknowledged in that society and proven. We are not talking about the realm of alternative medicine here. That is its own topic. It is not part of this discussion for the simple reason that it lacks an evidentiary basis, right? And the halacha does treat treatments which lack an evidentiary basis differently, right? They are in a different category. But those medicines which are viewed as having been tried and proven to work, it is a religious imperative to seek out those treatments when necessary. I would say this is obviously relevant to vaccines because vaccines are a classic medical treatment backed up by real science. The problem with vaccines and the way in which vaccines work a little differently is that vaccines are a prophylactic. They're not designed to make you better once you're sick. They're designed to stop you from getting sick in the first place. But having said that, in practice, most rabbis have treated prophylactics as part of the general realm of medicine, as part of the obligation to keep yourself in good working order. Right? This shows up in other areas as well, things like taking vitamins, right? I think it used to be very common that doctors would prescribe aspirin to people to keep their blood pressure within reasonable bounds, that as a prophylactic. Things like that, right, are all covered by the same general rule where we must take reasonable steps to keep ourselves healthy. Therefore, and again, we find another verse, take therefore good heed to yourselves, right? So again, look after yourselves, right? And we see here Maimonides, who was probably the single greatest codifier of Jewish law. He made the first ever comprehensive summary of all of Jewish law. And he said, and so too every stumbling block, which is liable to kill, it's a positive commandment to remove it and to guard against it and to be very, very careful, as it is said, but guard yourself and guard your soul. Okay. Now, I just want to talk about vaccines a little bit. My apologies for the picture, but it is a picture of smallpox, and it's going to be relevant in a second, right? So smallpox was a deadly disease. Thank God it was eradicated in the 20th century. It had a case fatality rate, depending on the outbreak, between 20 and 30% of symptomatic patients, meaning if you caught smallpox and you actually showed symptoms, you had between 20 and 30% chance of dying. It's a very deadly disease, and it was violently contagious. These outbreaks were really awful, and they'd crop up once every 20 or 30 years, and they'd decimate communities, and people were really, really terrified of smallpox. So very on, people tried things that look very much like our modern idea of vaccination. The first known attempt to do this is something called variolation. And it means you take these smallpox stabs, you grind them up into a powder, and then you inhale them. Right? And this was attempted in China. This was done in China starting from probably the 13th century, maybe even earlier. And it usually gave a mild case of smallpox to the person who did this, but afterwards they would be immune. Now, the problem with this is that it had a case fatality rate of 2.5%, meaning instead of the 20%, between 20 and 30% of people who caught smallpox would die, instead it was 2.5% of people who did this would die. But I do not think that in modern times we would accept a vaccine with a which gave you a worse than 1 in 50 chance of dying. That seems to me very high. But having said that, people did this, right? It ended up being really popular. It was brought to England, it was brought to Europe, and people really did this. And the reason why was because, frankly, they were so afraid of smallpox that they viewed this astonishingly high risk as being worth it. So that was the first attempt to inoculate against smallpox. Now, in the 18th century, a man called Dr. Robert Sutton, who lived in England, in southern England, discovered that you can make variolation safer, and they called it inoculation. And this is really important for us, right? This is where our sort of halach discussion is going to start. What they did was they would take blood from a person with a very mild case of smallpox. They would open up the vein on somebody's healthy and deposit that matter directly into their vein. They claimed that there was a case fatality rate from this procedure of about 1 in 1,000. Right? So still probably far higher than we would view as tolerable, but a lot better than variolation. And then finally, Dr. Edward Jenner, who also lived in the UK, developed the first modern vaccine. Basically, what happened is he observed that cow herds who had contracted a related disease called cowpox never got sick from smallpox. And so he said, well, what happens if we start actually infecting people deliberately with cowpox instead of, and then, let's see if they get sick from smallpox. So he did it. He started to inoculate people with cowpox, and then afterwards, he would inoculate them with smallpox directly, and they were immune. It worked, right? And there was apparently the case fatality rate was not measurable, right? So nobody died, right? This was actually worked, and the Jenner vaccine ended up becoming the basis for all of the smallpox vaccines, as far as I know. Right? So this is the context of our discussion. Some of our Jewish thinkers were familiar with the middle technique that we described, inoculation, which had a case fatality rate of 1 in 1,000. Some were already familiar with the Jenner vaccine, which was better, right? That is what they address. And so let's look at what they said. So the reactions. The first written reaction that we have, as far as I know, to smallpox vaccine was written by a man who actually wasn't a rabbi. It's a man called Avraham ben Shlomo Nanzig. He was just a man, very learned, but not a rabbi, who lived in London. He wrote and he published a book called the Ale Trufa, which means the Leaves of Healing, in 1785. And the reason why he published it was because he lost 2 of his sons to smallpox. Right, there was an outbreak in London at the time, and he lost 2 of his sons. And he basically published this booklet claiming that everybody should be inoculated. And he actually said that it was a religious imperative to receive inoculation because, sure, it involved a small risk. However, the risk from a proper case of smallpox was so much greater that it was better to take the small risk of inoculation. And the reason why this book is really significant is because it ended up being the starting point of the discussion for all rabbinic discussion of smallpox vaccines, or any vaccine for that matter after that. Everybody just starts with the Ale Trufa, and mostly they adopt his conclusions. The next person is the Tiferet Yisrael, Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz. He lived in Danzig, and he wrote the following. And from this, it seems to me permissible to make a pox inoculation, even though 1 in 1,000 dies from the inoculation in any case, if he develops natural smallpox, the danger is nearer. And therefore, he may place himself in a distant danger to save himself from imminent danger. Right now, what the Tiferet Yisrael is dealing with here is the idea that by taking a smallpox vaccine, you take on a small level of danger to yourself to prevent the much larger danger later on. That's what he's dealing with. And he says that's fine, right? That's completely fine because the danger of smallpox is so severe. The danger of the inoculation is relatively low. It is worth conducting the inoculation. And we see that that he was reacting to the inoculation, right? So he's saying the risk is he's reacting to a risk of about 1 in 1,000. And we see this transferred directly to the vaccine. So just for example, right, in the late 19th century, the British government passed a law that everyone must vaccinate their children. And at that point, we're talking about the actual vaccine from Dr. Edward Jenner, right? Meaning the cowpox-based vaccine. And a man called Henry Levy was unwilling, Jewish clearly, Levy, right? Unwilling to vaccinate his children because he felt that he should instead pray and rely on God to save him and his children from the disease. And the government fined him. And the question ended up going to the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom at the time, Rabbi Dr. Herman Adler, to ask, was he correct in his interpretation of the Jewish religion? Right, the courts asked, and the chief rabbi said the following: Henry Levy was not justified in making the statements contained in the letter, that the most competent medical authorities were agreed as to the vaccination being a prophylactic against smallpox, and added that its use was in perfect consonance with the letter and spirit of Judaism. So that's, I mean, I could go on, right? I can list literally dozens of rabbinic authorities who talk about the smallpox vaccine, but literally every single one of them, as far as I know, took the same approach. Jewish authorities all advocated for taking the smallpox vaccine, right? They advocated for inoculation when that was available, and it spread all the way through Europe. And then later on, they advocated for the vaccine proper when it became available because they acknowledged that the small risk from the vaccine was easily worth it. And they all contested correctly that Jewish law does not advocate from the perspective of just leaving it up to God if we will stay well, because the idea is you have to take all reasonable steps to keep yourself a healthy person, and that includes going to a doctor, right? It includes going to a doctor when ill or going to a doctor when you need to, right? You have to go to a doctor. So if you have to go to a doctor, there's no real reason to say you shouldn't take the medicine that the doctor is currently prescribing. You really ought to. Now, I said I would highlight where there is some controversy. There is controversy around what happens if somebody does not want to take the vaccine. Everybody agrees that you should. Almost everybody agrees that you really have to. What happens if someone refuses even so? So there's a bit of a disagreement. Some people say that they should actually be shunned, right? They should be kept away from the community because they are a danger to the community, right? It's not just that they are doing something unadvisable, not just that they're ignoring the advice of the doctors for themselves. If they were to do that, that would not be great, but that's at some level or another clearly their business. The problem is that they're putting everybody else in danger as well. They're actually assuming a level of risk for other people because they might be contagious. So there are many people who say that people who are not vaccinated should be shunned. And then there are many others who argue that we shouldn't go that far. The other place where this comes up is, what about the kids of people to be who are vaccinated? So if somebody chooses not to vaccinate their children, do we treat the children as though they're, adults who aren't vaccinating, right? Do we treat them punitively? Currently, I suppose not currently, pre-COVID-19, this really came to a head in the United States. A number of major ultra-Orthodox communities in the United States, for reasons that I'll get to in a minute, had very low vaccination rates, and they experienced large measles outbreaks. And so the question became, should the schools bar entry to students who have not received the MMR vaccine, right, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine? That was the question which came, and that's, a solid 80 to 90% of rabbinic authorities in the United States ruled that those schools should actually deny entry to students who weren't vaccinated because they were endangering the entire population, meaning there is a certain percentage of students who can't be vaccinated. Medically, they're not eligible for vaccination for whatever reason. And there's a certain number of students who do get vaccinated, but the vaccine doesn't work for them. So anybody who's willfully not taking the vaccine is really putting other people, it's not just assuming the risk for themselves, it's also assuming the risk for everybody else. And as a result, a fairly strong consensus developed that schools should not admit students who are not fully vaccinated. And that was pre-COVID, right? That was because of a measles outbreak. Now, modern reactions to the COVID-19 vaccine. Look, most rabbis are overwhelmingly in favor. And it's because of everything we just described, meaning you have to keep people safe, you have to keep yourself healthy, right? And human life is anyway going to be the overriding value as you have to go to a doctor if you need to. Like it just wasn't different to things that have already come up. So if you look, I mean, I've included here a few names at random. They're famous for being in favor of the COVID vaccine. Rabbi Herschel Schachter is the most senior rabbi in the Orthodox Union, which is the single biggest organization of shuls or synagogues in the entire world. He is the leading halachic decider of the Orthodox Union. He is on the record saying that everybody must be vaccinated. It's a halachic obligation to be vaccinated unless you have a medical reason to not receive it in consultation with your doctor. Rabbi Asher Weiss, similarly, he's the preeminent halachic authority among Jews in the land of Israel. Again, ruled that everyone must be vaccinated. In fact, he ruled not only that the COVID-19 vaccine is mandatory, but he ruled that the flu vaccine is mandatory because the public health authorities in Israel were saying that it was very important, in particular last year, for everybody to get their flu shot so that there wouldn't be, flu in addition to COVID. So he ruled that you must get both. And then Rabbi Yitzchak Silverstein, who is the leader of ultra-Orthodox Jewry at the moment, probably the senior most ultra-Orthodox rabbi in the world, and again ruled that just everybody must be vaccinated unless they have a real medical reason not to be. The vast majority of Orthodox Jews, as a result, are in favor of vaccination, and I'm not well-versed in the conservative and reform worlds. I assume that they also are largely in favor of vaccination. There is a small minority who's opposed. I'm sure that people have seen pictures like the one that I'm currently showing in the background here. This is a picture of a protest that happened in Brooklyn, actually not against vaccines, against mask wearing, and against the mask mandates, and against other social distancing rules that were in place in New York State at the time. I'm not going to discuss that in detail. However, I want to talk about the reasons why some Orthodox Jews have come out against the vaccine. I think part of it is opposition to government. So, as I'm sure everybody on the call is aware, Jews have a storied and unpleasant history with secular governments, and there is a lot of distrust. So, especially in ultra-Orthodox circles, you will often find that people are very distrustful of the government, and so the fact that the government is pushing these vaccines has caused a little bit of a sort of counter-reaction in the very, very ultra-Orthodox enclave, so people just don't trust the government. And in addition, these are people who often have a really strong distrust of the modern world, right? Meaning anything which looks or feels modern, they're opposed to. It's not a systematic philosophy, it's just more an idea that the second something looks modern, they're not interested. And as a result, they really are resisting the vaccines. Having said that, it is a very small minority. I do not think, I mean, there is no question it is a very small minority of the Orthodox Jewish world. The vast majority of halachic authorities and the vast majority of Orthodox Jews think that really everybody ought to be vaccinated. And Alex, as you know, I am, like you said, I am myself fully vaccinated. I posted about it on Facebook, and I think it's very, very important that we all get the vaccine as soon as possible, based on the fact that there is that the risk profile on these vaccines is simply so very, very low. And as far as I know, it is the sort of almost unanimous opinion of the medical establishment that we really all should be getting these vaccines. Now, one more point, I promised I'd mention it. Some of the data that we're seeing out of Israel now is that the vaccines they don't just prevent you from contracting COVID-19, they also prevent you from passing it on to someone else. And that is why not every vaccine works that way, but these vaccines do seem to. And as a result, that is why I think that it's really important that people are mindful. It's not just about you, right? As in, I've told a number of people this. As someone who is, thank God, young and healthy, I was not super worried about what would happen if I caught this disease. I mean, I might be one of the unlucky ones, but basically I'd probably be okay. It's also about not endangering other people, right? Having had the vaccine enables me to be confident that I'm not putting anybody else in danger. It's not just that I'm not endangering myself. And I do think that precisely because we've seen that people who are vaccinated are so much less likely to pass on the disease, even if they do contract it. It is therefore really crucial that everybody who is able to get vaccinated, and I think that is, like I said, really a consensus Jewish position.
Let me, in the meantime, introduce Reverend Melissa Clark. She's, as her bio said, she has a special interest in biblical studies and is about to complete her master's degree in theology at Trinity College, where she previously undertook her undergraduate studies also in theology. She's widely traveled and well-read and now lives in Wood End and is the priest of the parish of Wood End, Trentham, and is a member of the Anglican Diocese of the Bendigo region. So I've asked Melissa to give a little bit of a response to Rabbi Alex's perspective. I'm guessing some of it will be in agreement, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Rabbi Alexander, for your wisdom. I want to acknowledge that I sit on the Jarrah lands here in Wood End, and I honour our elders, past, present, and emerging. As there is appearing to be general agreement within the rabbis in Judaism, there is general agreement within the Anglican Church, at least. I'll speak from an Anglican perspective. I can't speak for all Christians, obviously, but our Archbishop of Melbourne has been very vocal about his support for vaccines and encouraging everyone to go and receive the vaccine if they're able to. So I received my second Pfizer shot on Tuesday. I felt like I'd been hit by a bus on Wednesday, but it was a joyful feeling like I'd been hit by a bus because, as you said, Rabbi Alexander, it's all about not whether or not I'm going to get sick, because I'm 46 and relatively healthy and well, so I will probably be okay. But my oldest parishioner is 96, and I would hate to think that I would carry something to her and cause her demise when she's such a sprightly 96-year-old, but nevertheless in such a high-risk bracket. So from a Christian perspective, it's very much a love your neighbour type ideal to go off and get vaccinated because it's for the good of all people. Now, we are people who speak about the body of Christ. We are people who understand the importance of the physical body as well as the spiritual body. So St. Paul was very keen to speak to us about the importance of being the hands, feet, voice, and workers for God. So if our bodies are not healthy, we can't do that. Bodies are a precious thing in the Christian faith because Jesus gave up his body and was crucified. So we have to honour that preciousness that was given to us by God, and the grace that comes through that, and the crucifixion and resurrection after that. So we, when it comes to caring for our community members, particularly we are called to care for the most vulnerable, as and we come from the Jewish faith. That is our history. So all of the things that Rabbi Alexander has said resonate with me. There is a parable that Jesus gives us in Luke's Gospel, the parable of the lost sheep, where Jesus says the good shepherd will leave 99 of his sheep and go after the one who is lost and unwell. So the value of life, of the single life, is extremely important. And your opening statement, Rabbi Alexander, about value of life certainly sits very comfortably with the parable of the single sheep that goes astray. And whether that is astray because of illness or whether it is astray because of moral decisions, regardless, God will be with them and will take extra special care. And as Christians, as people who sign up to follow this Jesus person, we have to do the same. We have to take special care of the ones who are vulnerable and unwell. So that is really the most important part of our faith, that we are one in sharing this body of Christ in which we live. And so any part that is sick means that the whole is not complete. So we need to be extra careful to seek out those who are unwell and those who are vulnerable. Throughout the lockdowns, of which I think we're up to number 4, my message to my congregations, because I look after 2 congregations, I look after Woodend and Trentham, the message has been love your neighbour. So we stay home in order to keep our neighbours healthy and well. And because we have 2 very, very small churches, we didn't open up between lockdowns last year. We were closed for most of last year because the 1 person per 4 square metre rule just meant that in one of our churches we were only allowed 8 people, and in the other we were allowed 14. So it was better for us to be apart and safe than come together. In saying that, we are not meant to live in isolation. We are not meant as humans to live alone and away from each other. So to get a vaccination, to have the world's scientists working on this in the way that they have, is miraculous in itself. That God raises up these wonderful people to do this amazing work is amazing and brilliant, and we should absolutely honour that. So in order for us to not have to live through more isolating periods, to my mind, there's no question that if we are able to get a vaccine and be safe for ourselves, but more importantly for others, then we should do that. It's almost an obligation to those of us who are healthy and able to be vaccinated to do it. Now, I noted that there were a couple of the rabbis that you spoke about, Rabbi Alexander, who or one, I think it was, who decided that prayer was the best option, and that he was not going to have vaccinations. And that has been an argument that's been thrown at me. Can't we just pray about this and God will do what God will do? And prayer is very important. It's a very important part of my life and the life of, I think I could speak for most Christians and say prayer is an important part of our lives. But so is action. And we have lots of biblical examples of people taking action, not being passive, not sitting and waiting for God to do what God will do, but actually getting up and taking care of business themselves. So there is an amazing story in Mark's Gospel about a woman who's been sick for 12 years. And she hears that Jesus is going to be in her part of the world. So she goes and hides amongst the crowd because she's unclean. She's a Jewish woman, so this illness makes her unclean. And she touches the hem of Jesus' clothes and she's healed because she has taken action in great faith and reached out her hand for healing. And she's indeed healed. And then she has this beautiful exchange with Jesus where he calls her daughter and sends her on her way, knowing that she's restored to her community once more because her health is well and she's no longer unclean. So that's been an argument that I've used back to people who've said, can't we just pray about this? That woman is an example to us to actually get out of our seats and do something positive for ourselves and for our community members. So I think it's important to acknowledge that we have to do something as well. It's not just sitting around waiting for someone else to do it or waiting for God or depending on certain parts of our prayer life to kick in so that we will be immune. As I said, God has raised up for us in our community amazing people who work study and are creative and understand how bodies and medicine work. And we are people who need to depend on each other. So when we have those wonderful scientists and medical workers coming up with these ideas and these treatments, then we should take full advantage of that, because I believe that is a God-given talent that they have, and that God is using them to better God's world. The being not passive people, I think that also leads us to be called to not be complacent either. We have had a very fortunate situation here in Australia where we have lost people, but not to the extent that other parts of the world have. And that's because we haven't been complacent, and we haven't just sat and done nothing. We have strong state leaders, and particularly our Premier here in Victoria has had to make some really tough decisions, and he has done so. And remarkably, the people have followed, and it has been good. But it's because we've not been complacent, and because we have not just sat around waiting for someone else to do the stuff. We've had to do what needs to be done, and that we've come through as well as we have. And that, the vaccine rollout has not been as swift as we thought it might be at the start of this year, but we are in a really good position, and that is because we've not been complacent and we've not been passive. We have been doers in all of this, and that very much speaks to the Christian faith, that we have to be people who do, not just sit back and wait for others to do for us. So one of our Bible readings only a couple of weeks ago, it might even have been last week, was of the disciples being sent out 2 by 2 to do the work of God. And although we can't be sent out very far at the moment, it is that doing that is what we're called to do as Christians, to be vaccinated, to be safe, to ensure that our neighbours are safe. And in an age where we can contact people quite easily, we have been able to do that as well. And although the mental stress has been quite huge for people this past 18 months, we are coming through it. And the more people that are vaccinated, the better I think the mental health impact will be on our community. So my final prayer for all of this is that not only are we vaccinated, but we acknowledge that there are countries in the world where vaccinations will not be so readily available, and that we will do what needs to be done there too, and send vaccines to Papua New Guinea and to our Pacific Islander friends who may not have the resources that we do. I think I've gone through my notes that I've taken down from Rabbi Alexander's wonderful talk, so I'm happy to take questions now as well.
Well, thank you to both of you. While I have the floor, let me ask the first question, and that might prompt some people to ask their own questions. So my first question, specifically to Rabbi Alex, is you said that it's an obligation for people to go to the doctor and to use proven medicines. In the case of vaccines, especially this COVID vaccine, which is new, at what point did the ruling to get this vaccine become such a thing? As in, it wasn't proven initially. You say now that all rabbis essentially agree that the community should get it. When did that happen immediately? At what point did that become the ruling?
Yeah, so it's it's funny. There's a sort of epistemological question that you're asking. A question about how do we know what we know, right? Well, how do we define knowledge, right? So I started off with the history of smallpox variolations and inoculations and vaccines. And I found no literature on variolation. I found no Jewish discussion. It doesn't seem to have registered for Jewish communities at all, as far as I know. But for inoculation, which was the procedure of literally taking the blood from someone who has smallpox and then sticking it into somebody else's veins. And then for the vaccination, which was just deliberately infecting them with cowpox, right? Because cowpox is a far milder disease. These methods were approached by the rabbis at the time and by, as far as like really everyone at the time. Like they really became very popular very quickly. These methods were seen as being proven and checked medicine. There weren't any double-blind studies conducted to check the effectiveness of inoculation or of vaccine. Like it just wasn't a thing, right? The doctors in question were clever people who, you know, worked something out and they sort of tried it a couple of times and it was like, hey, it works, right? Nothing that they did would have stood up to anything even remotely reflecting modern standards of evidence when it comes to medicine. So the standards that we have for when a vaccine comes to market, even under, you know, the sort of emergency use authorizations that have been used for COVID vaccines because they couldn't conceivably finish their clinical trials before they needed to be used, is just so high compared to what people used in the past. Now, I do think that at some level, what standard of evidence we accept is actually culturally contingent, right? So saying that somebody in the, you know, the 18th century would have thought that this is like ridiculously good evidence doesn't necessarily mean that we should take it that way, because our standards for what counts as good evidence are radically different. But even by those standards, look, these are really well-tested vaccines. If you look into the detail of just the size of the trials, the sort of really unanimity of the results, it's very impressive. I do think a question did come up earlier on last year. Can Jews participate in clinical trials of the vaccines? So that was an actual question that came up. And there, the answer is less obvious, because there you're working on basically an assumption that the science behind it is good, right? Meaning they wouldn't deliberately feed you something that they know is toxic, right? So like they're giving you something on thinking it's probably fine and that probably effective, but it's hard to know for sure, right? So is that acceptable in Jewish law? Most rabbis actually ruled yes. And part of what they based themselves on was the fact that the whole idea of checking medicines or checking anything with this level of rigor is very new. Like you go back 70, 80 years and it just wasn't done that way, right? And people took stuff, you know, because their experience sort of reflected that it worked. And I mean, look, at some level or another, we still a little bit function in that realm, rarely with something that we view as very dangerous. But like, you know, I don't know if anybody has ever been prescribed chicken soup for a cold. I mean, my mum is a doctor and she's told me that there's actually something to it, apparently. So there you go. But like, the reason why we eat chicken soup when we've got a cold is not because some scientist found some anti-inflammatory properties to chicken fat. It's because like, that's what everybody does, right? That's just that thing that makes us feel better. So I think that, yeah, like it's more what level of certainty do we need before we think that a medical obligation is triggered? I'm not sure, but it's a lot less than what our governments are requiring to let something come to market, right? Which sort of obviates the question these days. It means that it's not difficult. Like if it's gotten past the collective scientific genius of the Western world, as Melissa mentioned, then it's good enough. Like that's a sufficient level of certainty for our purposes as well.
Melissa, anything to add?
It needs to be acknowledged too that people have been working on vaccines for viruses for a very, very long time. So there is already a level of knowledge there that scientists know that this property will have this effect. And you know, although we know COVID-19 is a new virus and ever changing with all of the variants, we do know that there is a baseline there that they already know about. So the polio vaccine, for example, took, I think, 6 years to be developed, and that's 70 years ago. And there's now almost no polio in the world because of that. But that was 6 years. And I think people sort of look back to that and go, well, this has been not even 18 months and we have a vaccine already. But it's because scientists have worked on things like the HIV virus and the Ebola virus and all those other things that have a baseline of similarity that leads them to be called a virus. And so what they have to work on are the variants in it. Now, as for your chicken soup comment, Rabbi Alexander, I hope it's not chicken because I'm a vegetarian. I like to think that it's the steam and the liquid that is actually the magic that works in that.
It's all my medical training at play, you know.
Excellent, good.
And I also know we have Rabbi Fred Morgan from the Progressive Jewish Movement and Reverend Julie Hall also from another Christian denomination. So I wonder if they would like to maybe chip in at this point.
Well, I just could agree with Rabbi Alexander. You know,
this is a topic of unification.
Sorry?
This is a topic of unification.
I believe it is, yes. I know some people who are anti-vax and refuse to have vaccines, but I think it's not in the public interest to do that. So even if you personally felt that this wasn't a matter of pikuach nefesh, of saving a life or anything like that, nonetheless, in the interest of the public at large, for yourself, I mean, but in the interest of the public at large, you would be inclined to get vaccinated. So I agree totally with that position.
Yeah, I do think, I would say, I think that part of the current anti-vax position, which has unfortunately been rearing its head yet again with the current pandemic, but it's also been a factor, you know, with the MMRV vaccine and people thinking that maybe causes autism and I don't know, whatever else. I think, I look at pictures from when the polio vaccine came out, I think it was in the 50s, and people lined up, like they literally queued for hours to get the vaccine because they'd seen hospital wards full of people put in iron lungs, potentially for life. They'd had family members who died. Like this disease was no joke. And up until then, there was just no cure. Like you got it and whatever happened, and there was very little they could do for you. And then suddenly this miracle thing came out that was called a vaccine and it made it better. And people understood that it wasn't, I'm sorry, it wasn't healthy eating or essential oils that was protecting them. It was, you know, the miracle of modern science, a genuine miracle that God gave this to us. I think that we are very privileged that most of us, if not all of us on this call, probably don't remember those days. And we don't remember what it was like when these diseases were rampant. And we've forgotten what it was like to be genuinely in danger. And look, thank God, as Reverend Melissa mentioned, in Australia, we weren't even in danger from COVID-19 because our government took it seriously. So, like, I feel that we have reached, there's a level of privilege which has shielded us from the consequences of disease for so long that we've forgotten what it's like. And as a result, there's this almost decadence that some people have where they feel that they can, you know, trumpet their individual liberty and not get a vaccine. No, like you have a public obligation. You have to keep everybody. It's not just about you.
Yeah, I think privilege is the right word for all of this. I mean, with the rights that we have in this country, the right to say no to a vaccine, we also have responsibilities that go alongside that. And there are some who would focus more on the rights rather than the responsibilities. Now, I'm part of the local Rotary Club, and the reason that I mentioned the polio vaccine is that we are the Rotary Club of the world, the Rotary worldwide, is working on that greatly with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the numbers are remarkable of people who will line up and get vaccines for this because they have seen what it can do. And privilege is exactly the word, because we haven't seen that. And we know that if we got sick, we have world-class hospitals here. Whereas in developing countries, that might not be the case. Or even in rural areas, it might not be that you can just hop down to the doctor and get yourself checked for something if you start to feel unwell. Like it shows a level of arrogance, I think, that we might go, oh, well, you know, I'll let 5 million other people have this before I have it, just to see what happens if they fall in a big heap. And there's wonderful science behind all of this, and we trust science to do so much for us. Like if God forbid someone's diagnosed with cancer, they're going to go to a doctor and they're going to take the chemotherapy and the radiation therapy that is prescribed, 99 out of 100 times. But there's this level of resistance to these vaccines that it kind of doesn't gel with me. I think it does have something to do with distrust of governments, as you were mentioning before, Rabbi Alexander. There was a bit of a pullback due to distrust of governments and distrust of pharmaceutical companies. But in the long run, pharmaceutical companies have done amazing things for humanity, as have governments, really. Also done some pretty dodgy things. But overall, we live in a safe country. We live in a relatively safe part of the world. So it's our responsibility to do the right thing, to actually care for our neighbour by getting vaccinated if we're able to.
Can I respond to Colleen's comment in the chat? I completely agree with everything you said.
Yes, I wanted Colleen maybe to elaborate on it before you respond to us.
Sure.
Colleen, would you like to elaborate and tell for the benefit of everyone who's not on chat?
Well, I don't really know the ultra-Orthodox community well, but it's just interesting that it's my sense is that they are people whose way of putting faith together is very similar to Christian fundamentalists, which for the most part tend to be Pentecostal style Christians. And I know with Pentecostals there's a lot of suspicion of the world and suspicion of government, and also a high level of making decisions out of emotion rather than reason and emotion. I mean, we all make decisions based on our feelings, but they seem to be driven rather than guided. And it's just fascinating to me that they're the two groups that are particularly resisting their responsibilities and opportunities over vaccines.
So I don't think, like I said, I think that the vast majority of the ultra-Orthodox world has really gone with the vaccine.
Right.
Like it's a really small minority. It's a very vocal minority. They make a lot of noise. It's a really small minority. If we talk, I mean, I know the ultra-Orthodox community in Melbourne and in Israel a little better than I know the ones in the States. I can tell you, even if we talk about the lockdowns, so in Israel, they initially resisted the lockdowns. But there was an issue. The government in Israel did a bad job of communicating with them. But when the government sort of changed its communication strategy, the ultra-Orthodox community actually fell in line very quickly. And in Melbourne, I mean, I'm sure many people, if not everybody on the call, has seen the pictures of the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Melbourne who did not abide by the lockdown regulations. Having said that, I can tell you that the single biggest, easily the biggest ultra-Orthodox shul in Melbourne, Das Yisrael shul, the Das Rav was one of the first to shut down his shul when the lockdown happened, and he did not allow it to reopen until the government allowed it. And then he shut down again every single time he was told to without complaint, and he told his community to abide by it. So I think it's important not to paint these communities with an overbroad brush. I think almost every group of people has crazies.
Very true.
They're very good at making themselves heard, and I assume this is true of Christians as well, by the
Oh,
way.
absolutely,
I'm
absolutely.
more familiar with that world, but certainly in the Jewish world, every group has their crazies. I don't think that it's fair to say that, you know, it reflects on Judaism, that you know,
And I
Jews,
wasn't intending to say that.
or that for that matter
but-
reflects Christianity, that certain Pentecostals. I think it's that when you take anything to an extreme, it becomes, you know, batty and potentially extremely harmful. It's funny, for our book club for the shul, we actually just yesterday discussed a book called Educated by Tara Westover. If you haven't read it, you really should. And it's a book about a child of Mormon fundamentalists and how she gets an education and sort of enters the modern world. And again, it's the same story, and she sort of openly acknowledges in the book that most Mormons are nothing like her family, right? Because they're crazy. I think that it's more a function of people being ignorant or crazy, and less a function of people, and less a function of the specific religion. They would have found a different way to be crazy if they didn't have this available to them.
Yes, that's interesting. And of course, the other group that seem to flout the rules have been footballers.
I'm sorry?
The other group that have taken liberties have been footballers, which I guess in Melbourne would be considered a form of religion anyway.
I think
that
that
might
says
also come
something
back to
about
Melissa's-
ego rather than anything
Yes.
else.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
going to say that might come back to Melissa's point of privilege and ego.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a comment that someone named Gillian has put up about QAnon and Fox News, and I think they do have a lot to answer for.
Yeah.
The prevalence of people willing to just go and Google an answer and just think that one Google search or even 10 Google searches is going to be more secure than the chief health officer's years and years of dedicated work to public health. I think that is another ego problem that we have in this country. Don't want to speak for other countries, but I think in this country we certainly have that issue here. The idea that untested and unsafe information, or I use information lightly, is spread on something like Fox News or on any other platform is criminal. It's just ridiculous that would happen, to my mind.
I just want to say something. I have heard that Rupert Murdoch has had the COVID shot. So
Oh, really? That's interesting, isn't it?
I have never in my life gone to Google or whatever or Bing and fact check everything and asked people, what about this? What about that? In my entire life. I'm confident that I think we're on the right track. Took a while, but I'm confident now. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know the numbers of how many millions of people have been vaccinated in the world. Sadly, I know that there have been some deaths, but as Rabbi Alexander was saying about numbers that we will accept in this modern age, I think those numbers are very low.
For the AstraZeneca, it's something like 3 in a million.
Yeah.
I think.
Unfortunately, the media grabs hold of that 3.
Sorry?
Unfortunately, the media grabs hold of that 3 and runs with it because it sells papers and it sells advertising space.
The Pfizer, they're saying, I think also has some very rare incidents of myocarditis.
If you can see the
everything.
screen, this is the current world stats of vaccinations. So we're up to 2 billion
Wow.
Wow.
fully vaccinated at the moment.
2 billion partially vaccinated, first shot, no?
Yeah, well, I think the dark green line, which is at the top here.
That's
fully
dark. That's one dose.
sorry.
Fully vaccinated is the yeah.
Sorry. So it's 1 billion that's fully vaccinated,
Yeah.
and 2 billion that's at least partially.
And that's a miracle in itself, that within, I mean, the virus was first found in January, I think, last year. Or
December
February.
of the previous year, which
December?
is by COVID-19.
So it's 18 months and 2 billion people have been vaccinated. That is remarkable.
That it already exists as well, plus people who are vaccinated.
And from this week, a lot of us over 70s will be getting our second AstraZeneca shots. So we'll see the numbers in Victoria anyway, going up quite high, quite quickly. Whilst I'm actually speaking, I did look up what Pope Francis has said, and he concurs with the two speakers, thank you. What he actually says is, I believe morally everyone must take the vaccine, and it is a moral choice because it is about your life, but also the lives of others. So he concurs exactly with Jewish law there and our Christian law, of course, because I'm sure he's thinking of the lost sheep.
Thank you, Martin. I hope your daughter improves soon. Is it your daughter who's sick?
She's almost better. It was, I don't know what it was. It wasn't COVID. It was tested, but there's just some new virus that's going around there at the moment, and they don't know why yet. And so we might have that to look forward to next summer.
Oh, good Lord.
Just a cheerful thought.
Liz, I believe you have a question. You need to unmute.
I don't know if this is probably another discussion, but going back to smallpox, which has been eradicated, I think there's 1 or 2 samples of it left in the world, and occasionally it comes up, should it be destroyed, to get rid of it permanently. What would the halakhic response to that be? Because once it's destroyed, you can't develop if it comes back or something similar. And likewise, the Christian community.
I think that I mean I don't. It's very uncomfortable to think about a loaded gun like that lying around, right? I think my view on this is that I'm not really qualified to have an opinion.
Okay.
I think we have to rely on the scientists knowing what they're doing, both in terms of proper biocontainment and in terms of if they think they need to maintain these samples for research purposes, then they do. I'm not at all qualified, frankly, to be able to assess the risk versus the benefits of that proposition.
Yeah.
I think that it's important. I think it's very important for religious leaders to stay in our lane. So I can as in I'm perfectly happy to opine on the necessity to take a vaccine given the data that I am provided with, right, by people who are far more knowledgeable and who are qualified to do that. But I would be very uncomfortable expressing an opinion about the level of risk involved in that proposition, as much as it is I'm not disagreeing with you that it is scary. But yeah, if they say that it's necessary, then I think that it's, we have to take their word for it. I mean, these are the same people who brought us the COVID vaccines, so they presumably know what they're talking about, right?
I think that's where our moral obligation to vote properly comes into this sort of discussion. I agree with you, Rabbi Alexander, that we need to stay in our own lanes, but each of us who live in this country can vote properly and carefully and consider who it is that we're going to trust to look after these things. And although it is held by a scientific body, that disease, they're overseen by government agencies. So if we are lax with our understanding of the policies of government, then unfortunately those loaded guns that are lying around become a greater risk. In saying that, I don't believe, from what I know of it, that there is a risk. I believe it's kept carefully and consideredly, but it goes back to our moral obligation to engage with politics and engage with wider community groups. That I think that's where we fit into that conversation.
Oh, just asking that question about who recalls having an international certificate of vaccination to travel, and hopefully we'll be given them again and we'll travel again one day.
I've got a MyGov email that says I'm vaccinated.
Yeah, I got that too.
Look what I found.
I have it in my health record.
Yeah.
I found my certificate from traveling with P&O in 1968.
What was that? What was that post? Was that, what kind of vaccine did you get for that?
I had smallpox, cholera, typhoid, and I had typhoid second time. So the first time I had to have cholera and smallpox to travel internationally, and I could have had yellow fever, but I don't appear to have had that. Those were the days when you needed a smallpox vaccination to travel.
Interesting.
Probably.
When we were living in Tehran, there was an outbreak of cholera, and we got the vaccination. We were to queue up at the Louis Pasteur Institute to get the vaccination, and one of our parishioners was a nurse, and she said, well, it's only 30% effective anyway. She didn't bother getting it. But now, what's the vaccination rate, success rate of AstraZeneca and Pfizer? Something like 85% of that order. So how much we've improved.
I want to take the opportunity to thank our two speakers. What I found particularly interesting is how unifying the discussion was. As we often say in the Council of Christians and Jews, that as much as we talk about things that divide us, a lot of the time we talk about things that unite us. And I think this is really a great example of that, this has been a unifying session, one that we all agree on, both Christians and Jews, but also, as Rabbi Fred Morgan pointed out, within Judaism as well, and probably within other elements of Christianity too. So thank you all for being part of it. Thank you in particular, Rabbi Alex and Reverend Melissa. Thank you everyone else.